phrases with ought to. We ought to recycle more. You ought to stay curious. We ought to stay informed. We ought to value teamwork. We ought to stay organized. We ought to embrace change. They ought to see a doctor. He ought to read more books. She ought to stay motivated. He ought to save some money. They ought to stay organized. He ought to be more punctual. She ought to be more patient. She ought to take initiative. They ought to arrive by noon. He ought to practice patience. He ought to show more empathy. We ought to be more adaptable. She ought to follow the rules. We ought to embrace diversity. We ought to clean up the mess. You ought to get enough sleep. We ought to respect deadlines. He ought to learn a new skill. They ought to seek out mentors. We ought to set a good example. You ought to foster creativity. You ought to be more forgiving. We ought to help those in need. She ought to be more resilient. He ought to be more open-minded. She ought to exercise regularly. They ought to be more proactive. We ought to be more considerate. You ought to help your siblings. You ought to be more self-aware. You ought to practice gratitude. You ought to challenge yourself. You ought to challenge yourself. We ought to be more adventurous. They ought to be more inclusive. You ought to keep your promises. You ought to be open to feedback. He ought to prioritize his tasks. You ought to eat more vegetables. We ought to encourage creativity. She ought to pursue her passions. He ought to set clear boundaries. We ought to set achievable goals. She ought to be more resourceful. You ought to communicate clearly. She ought to practice mindfulness. They ought to be more disciplined. You ought to finish your homework. She ought to be open to new ideas. She ought to be open to new ideas. She ought to seek new experiences. He ought to be more goal-oriented. You ought to avoid procrastination. He ought to support his colleagues. You ought to make time for hobbies. He ought to manage his time better. You ought to drink plenty of water. They ought to celebrate milestones. You ought to follow a healthy diet. He ought to balance his priorities. He ought to focus on his strengths. We ought to celebrate our successes. He ought to reflect on his progress. You ought to listen to your parents. She ought to take a break and relax. He ought to seek out new challenges. They ought to practice good hygiene. They ought to strive for excellence. He ought to keep learning new things. She ought to be more detail-oriented. You ought to be honest with yourself. She ought to take time for self-care. They ought to be adaptable to change. They ought to seek feedback regularly. They ought to be attentive to details. You ought to embrace new technologies. He ought to stay focused on his goals. You ought to practice self-discipline. She ought to manage her emotions well. You ought to balance work and leisure. They ought to develop a growth mindset. We ought to build strong relationships. They ought to address conflicts calmly. She ought to manage stress effectively. We ought to practice critical thinking. You ought to be mindful of your impact. She ought to challenge her assumptions. She ought to apologize for her mistake. They ought to work towards their goals. She ought to practice more for the exam. She ought to practice more for the exam. They ought to practice active listening. He ought to take constructive criticism. We ought to support our local community. We ought to contribute to our community. They ought to learn from their mistakes. They ought to build a strong work ethic. He ought to explore innovative solutions. They ought to be diligent in their tasks. They ought to set realistic expectations. They ought to plan their trip in advance. She ought to be mindful of her deadlines. He ought to track his progress regularly. They ought to engage in lifelong learning. We ought to support each other's growth. You ought to manage your time efficiently. She ought to keep her workspace organized. She ought to keep her workspace organized. You ought to respect different viewpoints. He ought to manage his stress effectively. She ought to practice good time management. They ought to cultivate a positive mindset. They ought to maintain a positive attitude. He ought to seek out constructive feedback. They ought to contribute ideas in meetings. He ought to take better care of his health. She ought to be more considerate of others. She ought to develop her leadership skills. You ought to be careful with your finances. She ought to develop her negotiation skills. They ought to work on their teamwork skills. He ought to be more proactive in his career. We ought to respect other people's opinions. She ought to stay focused on her objectives. We ought to encourage each other's growth. They ought to participate in team activities. We ought to practice effective communication. They ought to acknowledge their achievements. He ought to work on his communication skills. She ought to manage her workload effectively. We ought to be more environmentally conscious. You ought to be proactive in solving problems. You ought to be proactive in solving problems. He ought to follow through on his commitments. We ought to acknowledge and address weaknesses. He ought to improve his problem-solving skills. She ought to be more strategic in her planning. We ought to foster a collaborative environment. She ought to be more proactive in her learning. We ought to be transparent in our communication. You ought to express your opinions respectfully. We ought to create a supportive work environment. We ought to practice empathy. He ought to stay committed to his personal growth. You ought to take responsibility for your actions. You ought to maintain a healthy work-life balance. He ought to work on building strong relationships. He ought to work on building strong relationships. She ought to remain open to learning opportunities. They ought to take responsibility for their actions.